Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Atlas Society webinar of this evening, Monday Night Philosophy Returns. We are having a webinar with our presenter is Aaron Day, the CEO of the Atlas Society. I'm William R. Thomas, the Director of Programs at the Atlas Society, and I'll be serving as a host and MC for this. But our topic for tonight is Galt's Gulch Now with Aaron Day. And Aaron is not only the CEO of the Atlas Society, he's also the CEO of the Tangerine Wellness Company, and he's a lifelong entrepreneur who also successfully created the company iEconomy, and he's brought a dynamism to our organization as CEO. So it's been wonderful having Aaron as a colleague.
Okay, great. Thank you, Will, for the introduction. Can you hear me, actually? Will, I know other people are muted.
I can hear you. You're fine.
Okay, fantastic. So with that said, I will jump right into the presentation, and thank you all for joining. Monday Night Philosophy is exciting. I know we try to do Monday Night Philosophy, and we often are conflicted with football and basketball and various other events, but it's actually great to see that we've been building a strong audience of people that are interested in philosophy. So tonight I'm talking about Galt's Gulch Now, and in essence what I wanted to do was do a little brief introduction about the Atlas Society and my own personal background. I want to talk about why Galt's Gulch Now, talk about some of the, and that's mostly the negative part of the presentation, but some of the data and the factors both within the U.S. and globally that are leading to the formation of a variety of alternative, I'll call them libertarian communities. Whether or not they meet the definition of Galt's Gulch, I guess, is ultimately the purpose of the presentation. I'm actually going to walk through a little bit about the importance of definitions and touch a little bit on objectivist theory. And then I'm going to attempt to define the essence of Galt's Gulch, and then I'm going to walk through a number of these libertarian alternative communities that have been formed using the Galt's Gulch moniker, and I'm going to examine whether or not they actually stand up to the definition of Galt's Gulch, which isn't to say that they're not worthy projects in their own right, but I think definitions do matter, and it's important to make sure that we're consistent in this, because if I know many of you from the list that I saw are new to objectivism, but as I'll demonstrate, objectivists don't necessarily get a fair shake in the media, and certainly not in academia. So we need to make sure that we are keeping our definitions and concepts consistent. And then I'll wrap up with a conclusion and Q&A. So I originally started this conversation, and I'm actually getting some feedback. I can't hear you. Let's see. All right. So Jerry, can you hear me now? Okay, I see that you can. Okay. I wanted to start. I gave this talk for the first time in February at the International Students for Liberty Conference, and I've given this presentation one other time at the New Hampshire Liberty Forum, and actually so much has changed just from the time that I gave the initial presentation. And one of the main things that I want to point out, and we announced this last week, and the producers of the movie announced this, but Atlas Shrugged Part 3, the film, has been greenlit, and it will be in theaters in 2014, which I think is not only great news, but it's also particularly relevant to the Galt's Gulch Now concept, since obviously Part 3 is the idea of Galt's Gulch is a pretty important aspect of that. And so the Atlas Society was involved with Parts 1 and Part 2. Our founder, David Kelly, consulted on the script, and so I did want to make that announcement before we launched into the rest of the presentation. I mean, I will say, I know this is probably an audience that's fairly familiar with objectivism, or at least Atlas Shrugged in some form or another, but if you haven't either read the book or seen either the first two movies, I will say that there are some spoiler alerts in this presentation, so just keep that in mind, although I still recommend that you go through the presentation, because it certainly is a long work, but I am going to hit on some of the key points of the novel, particularly as they relate to Galt's Gulch. I want to give you a little bit of background, a little bit about my own personal background and how I got involved with the Atlas Society. I have been interested in objectivism and started reading Rand when I was a teenager, and I went to a science and math oriented high school and actually started an objectivist group. And then I went to college and found that these objectivist ideas weren't exactly in the mainstream. In fact, I took a sociology class where, and this was in 1995, the professor was, this is just when the web was really born. This is when you had Netscape, which was the first web browser, which ultimately kind of launched the whole thing. And I had an old school sociology professor who said, well, these internet technologies are very dangerous because they allow for narrowcasting. They allow for different small groups of people to communicate with one another. What we really need is the BBC-style model of having a central authority speaking to everybody so that you have a common language and a common culture. And so, of course, is often the case, the professor happened to also be the author of the textbook that we had to pay $140 to buy. And every week we'd have to write these 1.5-page papers. And so at one point I would quote Rand, heavily. I would quote definitely objectivist thoughts. And so I wrote my little 1.5-page paper. And for the final of this group of papers, he wrote 3 pages of comments and red writing and said at the end, if you have the answers, why are you still in school? And that was probably the best advice he's ever given anybody, because I dropped out of school and actually started my first company, which was, of all things, an internet company in 1995. And actually the founders that I started the company with from high school had all read Atlas Shrugged. In fact, we had talked about the fact that we would get together every year, just as in Gulch, regardless of what happened with our startup or whatever, and similar to the model of Gulch. And so it was a huge influence on my life and my entrepreneurial endeavors. And so I sold my first company in 2001. I got involved in venture capital and started another company in the healthcare field, which called Tangerine Wellness, which is still in business. It's been around for going on 9 years. We're going to have our 9th year anniversary this year, and it's the fundamental business model as it applies to healthcare is very consistent with objectivism. It's a healthcare model that rewards people for actually improving their health. And it does so in a way based on objective measurements. And the initial focus has been on weight loss, and it's actually been phenomenally successful. We have clients that have worked with us for 6 years that have seen measured improvements. But I started my company in Massachusetts, had to deal with Romney Care, then subsequently had to deal with Obamacare, and then without going into all of the details, I've actually had to deal with the Secret Service, the Attorney General, other aspects related to Dodd-Frank. And so, in many respects, I've gone Galt in the sense that I'm not going to waver from the fundamental model. And when you actually look at ethics and what's behind Obamacare, it really is more John Rawls than Ayn Rand. In fact, it's explicitly John Rawls, and so it's one of those things that I think is probably going to ultimately have a very bad conclusion, for everyone. And so I actually found out about the Atlas Society when a colleague and I were on the phone, and actually he showed me the trailer for part 1, and I heard kind of the storied history of the Atlas Shrugged movies, and I saw something that our founder David Kelly had written, and that's how I ended up getting involved and even introduced to the Atlas Society. So the first time that I met the principals of the Atlas Society was actually at the red carpet premiere of Atlas Shrugged Part 1. So needless to say, Gulch and Atlas Shrugged has been a profound influence on my life. And I know that many of you on the phone are very familiar with your organization, but many are new. And our organization, the Atlas Society, is about promoting open objectivism. It really is the philosophy of reason, achievement, individualism, and freedom. We're a 22-year-old think tank, and as I mentioned, we've been involved with the movie, but for 22, going on 23 years, we've been putting on annual conferences. We've written books. We've published a number of papers actually pushing the philosophy of objectivism forward. We have a business rights center that defends the rights of businessmen that have been maligned by the media and by the government. And so I'm going to play a short video For those that aren't familiar with this, but objectivists and people that have followed Rand are not treated particularly well in popular culture, and I'll just start with this short video.
Maggie, time to go to the... Babies.
So that's a fairly common presentation in popular culture of Rand, and it very much has been presented as a cult, which isn't really consistent with the philosophy, and it's certainly not consistent with our organization. Our founder, David Kelly, started the organization as part of a split with another group called the Ayn Rand Institute. We promote the philosophy of open objectivism, which our real, guiding principles is that we have a commitment to reasoned, non-dogmatic discussion and debate, and we acknowledge that it's not a dead philosophy. It's something that's it's a philosophy that's open to expansion, refinement, and revision, and we really are open and benevolent towards talking to fellow travelers and critics. In fact, David was actually excommunicated for talking to a libertarian group, if you can imagine such a concept. And so the philosophy, and it is based on the original works of Ayn Rand, but a lot of what you hear about a cult and some of these other things are not, in fact, what we're all about. In fact, we're the opposite. We really are promoting this open philosophy. So with that, I wanted to walk through the introduction of what we're all about, but then I'll go into the meat of the presentation, which is, why Gulch now? And this is the, not that we needed, more bad news, but I've compiled a lot of facts and statistics about what's going on both at a global level and at the level of the United States with respect to political and economic freedom. And if you want to afterwards email me or ping me, and I'm happy to forward the background research on this. The Heritage Institute provides an index of economic freedom, and they've been doing this since 1995, and they actually measure economic freedom on a number of different levels. They look at rule of law, which includes property rights, freedom from corruption. They look at limited government, which includes fiscal freedom and government spending. They look at regulatory efficiency, including business freedom, labor freedom, monetary freedom, and open markets, which includes trade freedom, investment freedom, and financial freedom. So you can see what's going on at the global level. One of the most interesting things that when I look at this is that, oftentimes you have a conversation with somebody says, well, America is the greatest country in the world, and actually, as we go through these series of slides, actually, objectively, we've been on a downward trend for a number of years. We aren't actually number one in terms of economic freedom. In fact, we're number 10 in terms of economic freedom, and we're on the downward trend in that regard, with Hong Kong, Singapore, and Australia rounding out the top three. So that's again on the economic freedom spectrum. Then we have the freedom in the world. This is an index that Freedom House has been putting together since 1972. And they've been looking at 195 countries and 14 related disputed territories. And they're really examining two things. They're examining political rights and civil liberties. And they look at electoral process, political pluralism and participation, the functioning of the government, freedom of expression and belief, associational and organizational rights, rule of law, and personal autonomy and individual rights. And so you can see where the world is. In terms of most of the world is not free, again, at a really high level with only 3 buckets, we certainly are free. And one thing I left out with, this applies to both the personal and political freedom graph as well as the Heritage Index, which is the global economic and political freedom has been on the decline for the last 7 years. So while you definitely see different changes in values, overall the world is is actually less free, and there is a pretty strong momentum in the negative direction. So you can see on this particular chart, shows that democracy's actually declined for 7 straight years. You're actually seeing the improved decline line is not in a particularly favorable direction. Then we have, within the United States, the Mercatus Center puts out a report every 2 years, and actually this has been a little bit confusing because I've analyzed this. Actually, when I first gave the presentation, I was working off of the old data, so I had to update it. But they just published on March the 28th their 2013 Center Freedom in the 50 States. It's actually based on data from 2011, so it's a little bit lagging. But in any event, what you'll see, I mean, you can see North Dakota, South Dakota, Oklahoma, Tennessee, New Hampshire are the top 5, and then a lot of, probably not the surprising, usual suspects are colored accordingly. And this is just kind of a text list of what's going on a state-by-state basis. But again, just as with political freedom and economic freedom globally, the aggregate freedom amongst states is on the decline. So, like I said, this isn't the real positive part of the conversation. But then, we can walk into much more positive numbers like the U.S. debt clock, which, we have $123 trillion of unfunded liabilities, $16.7 trillion of national debt. And in this data, I recommend, check in. I wouldn't say frequently, but check in from time to time, because it's amazing how quickly these numbers change. And for as long as I've been tracking this, I've never seen anything moving in a positive direction. But I think even more telling than that is from Zero Hedge, a graph of Smith & Wesson gun sales. So I mean, you can see how all of this is kind of pieced together. But you can say, well, all right, well, things are bad, but is the future looking brighter? And there is a 2011 Pew Research Center survey of 18 to 29-year-olds that asked them to rank how they feel about socialism versus capitalism. Well, unfortunately, our youngsters seem to have a more positive view of socialism than capitalism. So this isn't a great trend either. And then you can move into our current political environment. And I originally put this presentation together right after the State of the Union. And so we had, right after that galvanizing speech, the announcement of an increase in minimum wage, use of executive power to increase environmental regulation, some new stimulus, all paid for by new taxes on the wealthy. But even beyond that, just since that time, we now have Karl Rove and other establishment players trying to root out Tea Party candidates, and there's a complete civil war within the Republican Party. Even after Rand Paul's filibuster effort, you now have a backlash with folks like Rick Santorum and Mike Huckabee making a big stand for social conservatives. And so, if you're banking on national political change, I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that may or may not be in the cards. And so, all of this being said, at a global level within the country, it's caused a lot of people to look at this and say, well, do I go Galt? What do I do? And you're seeing the formation of a number of alternative communities, which I will talk about the specifics of those shortly, but I do want to jump a little bit into objectivism and talk about the importance of definitions. And again, I played the brief clip with the Simpsons showing the portrayal of Rand, kind of a cultish mindset there. We recently produced a book or booklet called The Myths About Ayn Rand, but all of this content is available on our site. These are issues that we deal with on a constant level. These are the most egregious myths that we encounter, which the myths are that Ayn Rand was an elitist, that she was a conservative, that she was for dog-eat-dog selfishness, that she was simply pro-wealthy, and that she wasn't a serious philosopher. So in this booklet and also on our website, which you can read in our Atlas Shrugged area, we've gone through and systematically and concisely described why, in fact, those are myths. But when I realized that I actually was the CEO of the Atlas Society was when it was announced that I was speaking at the New Hampshire Liberty Forum, and somebody commented on Facebook. In the title of my involvement in this event was, Aaron Day is going to deliver a presentation called Gulch Now. Well, the comment that we got is, may that swine materialist Aaron Day burn in Randroid hell, down with objectivism, down with materialism, and end to objectivist oppression of blacks. And so this is actually what we face. And so everything that I described about the myths, the media is constantly lambasting our efforts and the philosophy without necessarily having read it. But I mean, this is the kind of thing that you find, from time to time. So definitions matter, and getting objectivism right matters, which is part of why in this presentation I actually want to define what Gulch is and what it isn't, so that it doesn't become another one of these matters that is just confused or misinterpreted to the detriment of a philosophy that is very much pro-happiness, pro-individualism, pro-reason. It's a philosophy that really provides a way of being successful in enjoying life, but we get constantly bombarded with these other issues. So when you come up with definitions, and there's a whole philosophy, there's a whole body of work on this, and in fact, in the interest of time, I will just say we've launched an Atlas University, which we have a number of free courses on our website. Will Thomas, who introduced me, has a fantastic lecture on the conceptual faculty of reason, where he goes in and describes, in essence, how the process of how to go through and look at definitions objectively. And I've always been struck looking at education at how you can see objectivism and subjectivism at work. And this is no clearer than when it comes to reading. You have phonics, and the idea with phonics is that you have letters, and those letters make up phenoms, and those phenoms make up words, and those words make sentences. So you learn an alphabet, you learn these various components, and now these are new things that you can put together. You're basically perceiving reality on a series of abstract facts. This is essentially how our language operates. However, when public education came about in 1930s, you had the introduction moving away from phonics to something called the look-say method of reading. And Dr. Gray is responsible for producing the literary, brilliant Dick and Jane series of books. Dick, look, Jane, look, see Dick, see, OC, see Dick, OC. And the idea behind this was that you treat each word as a whole, as if it were an image, just as with Chinese characters, where in fact there are tens of thousands of characters. You may only need to know a few hundred in order to be able to read a newspaper, but they're actually literally tens of thousands of characters. That is the way that language it actually continues to be taught to a certain degree, and it was introduced by folks that had a very specific political agenda. The original Dick and Jane pre-primer had 68 words, 39 pages of story and text, and for example, the word look was in there 8 times. By 1951, the primer had 172 pages, 184 illustrations, over 2,600 words, and the word look was in there 110 times. And so basically, I mean, this is exactly, I mean, it is rote. I mean, literally, this is the approach that was taken. And when asked about this and quizzed about this, from the perspective of the educators at the time, if you saw the word pony and you thought it was a horse or a pony, an actual pony, from the perspective of this technique, that was okay because you're close enough. And so similarly, well, what is the idea behind a car? Well, if you thought a car was a car or a truck, whatever, you got it, I guess we're Monday night philosophy using a football analogy, we got it between the uprights. And now if we're talking about the concept of billion, again, maybe this is part of the reason we have the U.S. debt clock that we have, but this was a completely acceptable approach from the folks that were driving the philosophy behind public education. And all this is just a way to show the pernicious influence of subjectivism. And we've seen the results. Actually, before this method was introduced, dyslexia was actually unheard of. It only became a problem after these Dick and Jane primers were introduced. And so by 1944, 70% of school failures were related to dyslexia. And I mean, you can see the statistics here. By 1972, only 32% of New York City pupils were reading at a grade level. But one of the most damning pieces of data is that you look at Massachusetts literacy. In 1910, 1 out of 1,000 children between the ages of 10 and 14 were illiterate. By 1984, 40% were functionally illiterate. And a lot of it was due to the fact that if you have an alphabet that's composed in a different way, and then you try to treat it like this other system, you try to treat words as if they were images, it created a pretty problematic situation. And so kind of the results speak for themselves, and there are a number of books that have been written about this. Actually, the book that I enjoy the most is NEA Trojan Horse in Education, which actually outlines the whole history of public education going back from day one, and kind of outlines a lot of these different steps. And so this is, you know, it's a little bit of a sidetrack, but I did want to talk a little bit about objectivism versus subjectivism, and how profoundly the approaches matter and have an effect. And so, again, the point of the conversation today is to talk about Galt's Gulch. And so I want to start by saying this is a picture of Ouray, Colorado, which this was the initial inspiration for Rand. She actually visited this site, so this is an actual picture of that place in Colorado. We actually have some supporters that are involved in the organization that literally live in Galt's Gulch. But before trying to define Galt's Gulch, I want to talk a little bit about why Rand wrote Atlas Shrugged to begin with, and what her motivation was behind Galt's Gulch, and actually behind the book itself. And so what you're seeing on the left is a friend of hers, Isabel Patterson, who, after her success with the Fountainhead, approached Rand and said, you know, you should write a nonfiction book about your philosophy. Why are you always, you know, focusing on these fictional works? And Rand didn't want to. And so Patterson said, well, you know, readers really need this kind of book. And Rand's response was, oh, they do? Well, what if I went on strike? What if all of the creative minds of the world went on strike? Wouldn't that make a great novel? And so that was her motivating force for actually writing the initial work. And I think it's important to put that into perspective. It really is this idea of going on strike, and that you're an individual, and the idea that just because somebody thinks that you need to do something is not justification in and of itself. And so knowing that actually is really helpful in looking at what she put together. So with Galt's Gulch itself, there are not a significant number of key events, but there are some. Just as a refresher or a spoiler, initially Midas Mulligan bought the valley not for reasons of it being, you know, Galt's Gulch, but for actually mining and for economic purposes. John Galt then subsequently recruited Midas Mulligan, and then Dagny crashes into the Gulch. Galt is rescued. All the people go back to the valley. I'm obviously skipping through 1,200 pages of text here. But at the end, importantly, Galt calls off the strike, and everyone returns to rebuild society. And so those are kind of the key points. But I want to look at Galt's Gulch from a structural perspective. It really was structured more as a kind of a homestead than anything else. Midas Mulligan really did own the land, and he rented it out to everyone. And so he also operated the bank that operated solely in gold and silver. John Galt provided the energy for the valley through his electrostatic engine, which was hidden, but it provided the energy for the entire valley and for all the homes. The original inhabitants of Galt's Gulch were Midas Mulligan, Narragansett, the judge, Haley, the composer. They were the original permanent members of Galt's Gulch. And the idea originally was that people went on strike, but they didn't live permanently in Galt's Gulch. They would visit during the month of June, and But after a while, you know, this concept wasn't really workable. It was actually somewhat of a security risk. And so ultimately all but 10 people moved to the Gulch on a permanent basis. And if you look at how it was structured, it was mostly an agrarian economy. Most people weren't actually able to work in their original fields. Even the judge, you know, while he was there to arbitrate, he wasn't called upon. He actually was a chicken and dairy farmer. Most of the strikers actually became gardeners or farmers. Even Midas Mulligan grew wheat and other agricultural products. Richard Haley grew fruit trees. Francisco ran a mine, which was his original profession. You had Ken Daniger prospecting for iron. You had Thomas Hendricks, who was, you know, almost the exclusive provider of medical services. Alice Wyatt was providing oil. But you know, nevertheless, this was the economic structure. But again, the idea is, which I'll get to, it wasn't necessarily envisioning a utopia per se. There was a particular motivation behind even having the Gulch. Even if you start looking at issues like defense and immigration, these are always popular subjects and things to talk about, but there really wasn't any physical defense. There wasn't a police force per se. Galt built reflector rays that projected a false image so that you really couldn't see Galt's Gulch from the air, but beyond that, there wasn't a need for police internally. In terms of an external military force, you had Ragnar Danejeld, who was the pirate, and his only activities were, I mean, he seized some government relief ships and then destroyed one of Francisco de Antonio's ships at Francisco's own request, but it wasn't, it certainly wasn't an aggressive outward political, or excuse me, military force. And the rules for immigration were very simple. In order to be, you know, to become a member of Galt's Gulch, you must be a striker. You must be prepared to provide useful, or prepared to find useful employment, and you must not reveal the location of the Gulch. But more importantly was the striker's oath, and this really was the defining statement about Galt's Gulch, which is, I swear by my life and my love of it that I will never live for the sake of another man nor ask another man to live for mine. That is the core oath. That is really the core, you know, philosophy of the Gulch. And if you're unwilling to adhere to that, then, you know, in essence, that you're not going to be a part of that community. And so, so in essence, if you actually boil it down, where it was geographically, I mean, the points that I made about immigration, defense, so on and so forth, the way I would define Galt's Gulch after looking at that is it's a hidden location where striking men of the mind, you know, if you were politically correct now, I guess you'd say men and women of the mind, temporarily locate, that operates on the philosophy of rational self-interest. That is really the essential definition of Galt's Gulch. It's not, and in fact, the Gulch itself only lasted for 10 years. And again, at the end, the strike was over, everyone left and went back to rebuild. So it wasn't intended to be this utopia away from everything else. This was just kind of a demonstration case of how, if you actually adhere to this philosophy of rational self-interest, you would work within that type of community. And so, with that said, I actually want to walk through and look at some of the communities that have formed recently, some of which use the Galt's Gulch name. And this isn't a new phenomenon, but it's actually the interest level and the number of communities and the amount of money has spiked to a fever pitch just within the last couple of years. But it's not a new phenomenon. Libertarian communities have been formed. Well, I mean, you can see this is from The Economist. Going back to 1967, you had the Principality of Sealand, where you had, you know, seized gun tower. They seized gun tower off the British coast, declared statehood, issued passports. Again, you know, disabled by fires. You saw Operation Atlantis by a huge Ayn Rand fan who built a boat which made it to Bahamas, sunk in a hurricane. On and on and on down the line. In fact, the only one on the list here that you will see, which I will talk about, and I will disclose up front, which I'm actually a member of, is the Free State Project. So it's the only one that's actually on this list. But But the idea of if you're sitting around saying, well, what am I going to do? I want to go Galt. Where do I go? This, political situation's a mess. Obviously, the first part of my presentation wasn't exactly uplifting about the future, but here we are. Where do we go? There are some cautionary tales in what's been tried in the past. I want to talk about one in particular, and again, I don't want to be controversial about this in the sense that you can say a lot about one Beck, and I'm not going to say a lot about one Beck, but he's announced a project called Independence USA, and he's referred to it as Gulch. It's an aspirational project, but as I've defined Gulch, I want to show you Beck's characterization of his project in his own words, and then we can kind of evaluate how it stacks up relative to the essence of Gulch.
Oh boy, here we go. Independence, USA. It is an entire city developed around patterns. I believe that if we're ever going to build something like this, I believe it needs to leave the message. You will have to literally wipe us off the face of the earth and wipe us off the map before you could erase the truth that is America. Everything should be embedded in its architecture. My favorite vacations are going to the mountains and just shutting off all the electronic devices, no TV, nothing, and watching the kids. After about 2 days, their imaginations start running wild, and they stop saying, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? There's nothing to do here. And all of a sudden, everybody's making, magic castles or for warriors out of some rocks, or watching, the kids be superheroes to save the planet from, the invading cows from another planet, and then seeing the cows turn on them and go, wait a minute, you're a kid. And they all come screaming back. We have to have simpler times. And this is, right here, the marketplace. The marketplace is where people, there's not going to be a gap here. There's no Ann Taylor. You want an Ann Taylor, go someplace else. This is Gulch. This is where dreamers go. This is where people work and create their own business, quintessentially American businesses, but it's more than that. It's also a place where people gather and people share ideas. We're looking for ways to redesign our residential areas so we can, first of all, break the class barriers. The reason why $8 million houses don't want to be next to, trailers is because it's a trailer and that's an $8 million house and they look very differently. But you can put affordable housing next to not affordable housing and have rich people and people who are still up and coming live in the same area and it all be good is really a heart. The reason why this is here is because everything leads to that. Everything is centered on that. This, to me, is a representation of man reaching up to find God's knowledge, but God's knowledge always is there. It's like sunlight. This is a giant sunlight collector and emitter at night. It collects the light and it exposes underground here this whole complex. This is my baby. This is a rare manuscript library. This is my National Archives. We will keep the things and the ideas and the books and the papers that tell the truth. Nobody is going to tell me, well, that's not the truth. You don't have any. Really? Let me go to the archives and get it for you. Let me show you. Let me show you exactly what they used when they built America. But it's more than that. You see here, this is an exploded church, if you will. This is a facade of an old church, but it has no walls. It's all under glass. And this, too, collects the light, and the light comes through the bottom here and exposes here the Learning Center. David Barton and I and others are working on, look, before you send your kids to college, you come with us. And you come here and you spend a week. You have a kid that's going into college. You spend a week with us. We're going to tell them exactly, we will show them the truth, we will tell them what they're going to try to do, and we will deprogram them every summer if you care. We have to teach how to grow food, and we have to be able to produce more than we consume. Everything in this, this Independence Park, if you will, we produce more than we consume. The farms, the goal would be to provide all of the food for the area, or as much of it as we possibly could. And the extra vegetables and the extra things we would ship off and sell elsewhere. The same with energy. One of the things that we're developing now on energy in the Dream Labs is for this. Because we have to be able to produce energy and be self-sufficient.
So in any event, it's certainly it's an ambitious project. The summary of it is it's a city theme hybrid. It's going to cost over $2 billion. It was very heavily influenced by Walt Disney. I apologize for the length of that clip. I actually had to edit down almost 30 minutes of footage, and it was a little bit difficult to actually figure out which pieces exactly to include because some of the explanations. It's clearly at the concept phase, but there are a lot of things that are really not consistent with Galt's Gulch. The multi-denominational mission center that teaches farming and a lot of the other areas. I mean, at the end of the day, it's based on the criteria that I outlined. Is it based on rational self-interest? No. Is it a temporary place? No. Is it hidden? No. Is it for striking minimum? I don't think that it in any way meets the essential criteria of Galt's Gulch. Again, it may be a great project, but what I worry about is, again, just kind of consistency. There's been Rand put quite a lot of thought and effort into her philosophy and into Atlas Shrugged and into this concept, and so I think it's important to keep that in mind. In the interest of time, I'm not going to. I have another video, but I'm not going to show it. I'll walk through it though. The Free State Project is a New Hampshire-based project, and the idea and the tagline behind the organization is "Liberty in Our Lifetime." And the idea is to get 20,000 people to sign. Once 20,000 people sign, then everybody agrees to move to New Hampshire. I actually should update this. I just saw a Facebook thing this morning that they're 14 away from hitting 14,000 signers. There are over 1,100 people that have already moved, and there are, I believe, 12 or 13 elected officials at the state level in New Hampshire that have actually been actively involved in passing legislation. And so it's as the Economist list shows, it's the last man standing on that list. And while I like it and personally support it, I also don't think that it would be fair. And I talked to the president of the Free State Project, and we talked about it because on the one hand it's like, well, great, it's where's Galt's Gulch? It's in New Hampshire, but actually upon reflection, that I think that would not be a great way of kind of describing it. It again doesn't meet some of these very important criteria. And I will say, I'm going to go through a few more of these, but none of them meet the Galt's Gulch criteria. And in part, it's something that's actually that's hidden, where you have to take the oath as a prominent feature. And so, if I knew of a Galt's Gulch, I couldn't talk about it. So I mean, I guess that's one component to it. But beyond that, that's kind of a minor point. Looking at these these endeavors, there's Galt's Gulch Chile, which was designed to be a self-sustaining community, but it really is more, I think, positioned as a resort. It was co-founded by Jeff Berwick. Tours are beginning this year. 4,200 acres. You can buy lots in sizes from 1.25 to 10 acres. And again, the punchline here: it's a serene and secluded valley. It's self-sustaining, world-class amenities, but with that said, it's not. I would say this is kind of applying Galt's Gulch to a resort, but not really capturing the essence of rational self-interest or getting at the core points. There are a series of other projects And in fact, it's actually, and when we get to the Q&A, I'm sure I've left some out, but I'm trying to do an exhaustive search. Launched at about the same time as Glen Beck's independent project is the Citadel, which is a project in Idaho, in the mountains of Idaho, where they're looking to, and they haven't picked a specific location yet, but have 2,000 to 3,000 acres, and part of their constitution states that you must demonstrate proficiency in shooting. And I think if you can't get 7 out of 10 at target practice, you know, you're out. You're kind of thrown out. But this one again is still in the early stages. They're discussing and contemplating a 120 to 180 day approval process, and this is something you're going to be able to see. They're going to start showcasing something, I don't know what, but in the spring and summer of 2013. So this is another project. Then we have the Seasteading Institute. And the idea here is that these would be floating cities, which will allow, as they describe it, the next generation of pioneers to peacefully test new ideas for government. And their focus is primarily on engineering and technical hurdles, not focusing on the practical applications or the specific governance structures. And this is an organization that was founded by Patrick Friedman, who is the grandson of Nobel Prize-winning economist Milton Friedman, and this has been funded in a significant way by Peter Thiel. It was started 5 years ago based on the West Coast, and as I said, they're not focused on the practical applications. I saw a presentation on this. They said, we'll figure out how to have a floating community, but whether or not you can figure out how to create an economically viable proposition within these communities, that's kind of up to you. My point behind this isn't that whether it's a good idea or a bad idea, but it's a really early stage idea that, in addition to everything else, has legal and technical hurdles and costs associated with it. There is an offshoot of this, which Patrick Friedman also started, called Future Cities, and the idea there is to try to identify countries where the government may be more favorable towards experimenting with, I'll call it libertarian-ish forms of government. And their initial target was Honduras. And Honduras originally said, actually, that the Congress passed an amendment to the Constitution in a 126-to-1 vote saying, yes, we will allow this Future Cities Honduras project to exist with this kind of alternative government structure. So there was a lot of excitement about it, and then the Supreme Court came in and shot it down 13-2, and the whole project was, in essence, abandoned. I've done some further research on this, and Future Cities isn't dead as a concept. Their next target is actually Belize, but the point is that it's tough everywhere, and if you find yourself trying to get political freedom from a sovereign nation that has a completely different political system, you just understand that there are some pretty significant risks associated with that approach. And so I'm continuing to build a library on this, but the net effect of this is that the spiraling negative global trends on economic, personal, and political freedom have created a situation where people are looking for liberty and freedom. Definitions matter. With respect to Galt's Gulch and respect to objectivism and the philosophy of Rand, it is very important to understand Galt's Gulch and the essence of Galt's Gulch. And when anybody comes up with a project and they call it Galt's Gulch, to actually understand the true meaning so that you can vet it and analyze it properly. And that's, so that's one thing that I really wanted to convey here. But at the same time, I did want to introduce these alternative communities, make people aware of them, and open up the discussion on some of these novel models. And so with that said, I would just say two things. We have, we are a nonprofit, so I guess the CEO, it's incumbent upon me to state that we are a nonprofit, and we operate on donations, and in particular we have an Atlas Shrugged capital campaign where the proceeds are specifically used towards promoting the ideas in Atlas Shrugged and also our involvement with the movies. But it's both. It's the long-term promotion of the ideas in the context of the movie. And I wanted to make everyone aware of the fact that we have an Atlas Summit, which is an annual event where we have a couple of dozen objectivist speakers. It is a phenomenal event. I mean, I guess it is. I guess I can't call it Galt's Gulch based on what I've just defined, but it is nevertheless a very exciting opportunity to hear all kinds of fantastic presentations on objectivism and interact with a phenomenal community. So I have the URLs here, and we'll send around additional information. And with that said, I'm happy to turn it over to questions. I guess I've technically left only 3 minutes and 28 seconds, but certainly we can go over as long as anyone wants to talk.
And I'm Will Thomas. I'm your MC here. Donovan Albanese, you had your hand up, so I will unmute you. Donovan, did you have a question?
Well, I really had more of a comment than a question. One of the key attributes that I think of in terms of Galt's Gulch is that it's kind of the objectivist utopia. And so I think a lot of people view Galt's Gulch as a utopian society. Of course, some of these people like Glenn Beck are not objectivists, so they have their own elements that they would try to combine with the elements that they admire in Atlas Shrugged to form their own quote-unquote utopia. I guess that's really my only comment.
Aaron Day, any response to that?
Well, no, I mean, I appreciate that it's a utopia, but I would define it as a utopia, and a short-term, a temporary utopia where the intention is to reintegrate in society. So utopia, I guess we could talk about the definition of utopia for quite a while. But yes, I mean, clearly, by the fact that everyone that is participating in the Gulch is operating under, takes the oath and is operating based on rational self-interest. In that sense, it is a utopia. It's not intended to be a destination. It's a temporary resting place while the rest of society understand what happens when productive elements meet society.
All right, thanks. Robert Smith has his hand up. Robert, I'm unmuting you. If you have a question, go ahead. Robert Smith? Robert, you there? Robert Smith? Well, while we're waiting to see if Robert comes on, Cameron Craig had his hand up, so Cameron, I'm unmuting you.
Yes, thank you, Will and Aaron. Good presentation. I'm not going to plug the organization that I represent, which is timetoshrug.org, but I'll talk about it later if anybody's interested. But really, I wanted to talk about why I came to have timetoshrug.org. Many years ago, I was in a conversation with a liberal about objectivism and related items, and he'd read a little bit about it, but was certainly not an objectivist, and he made the comment, well, if you don't like it, leave. And he talked about Gulch and all you discontents, malcontents should just go off and do something on your own. And of course that was the predominant thinking in the book and a lot of this discussion tonight. But shortly after that, I of course didn't think of it at the time I was face to face. I thought, why the hell should I leave? Why don't you leave? Why do we presume, because we are in a very, very small minority, that it's our job to pull out? Well, we can't vote the majority, and there's a lot of reasons we can't. So my thought, and this goes back 10 years, I'm a 45-year objectivist, so I'm not new to the thought, is let's find a way to strike without going to Ouray. And I live not too far from Ouray, it's a beautiful place, but how can we effectively do what Rand described without leaving where we are, our family, friends, jobs, companies, whatever it might be? And so how can we effectively have a Gulch in attitude and in some sort of way to go on strike, withhold, what we have and what we earn, and how we can, not be the victim and not give sanctions to the looters, and that's what I'm all about. So I'm enjoying this, but I do think there's an alternative to picking up and moving. Thank you.
Cameron, good to hear from you. I think that's it's a great point. But I do think that the reality is we've gone through the election cycles that we've gone through, and so the question is, how are you going to go about accomplishing that? Changing the political system and moving is one way of doing it. Obviously, the Owl Society, we are all about creating cultural change and trying to communicate, transmit these ideas to as many people as we can, regardless of where you are and what the context is. So I would argue that that's our whole reason for being, and we want to do that at a very fundamental level. But I just wanted to outline some of the different communities that have formed out there, and then relate those to the essential definition of Galt's Gulch.
Sure.
Great. Well, thanks, Cameron. I'm going to mute you again just to keep noise down here, but feel free to raise your hand if you have something else. Jen Coffey, you have your hand raised. Jen?
Hi, thank you. I understand the concepts, and actually I'm probably one of the newer folks involved, in the sense that I only awoke to my reality in around 2005. But in looking at present day, outside of working within systems of trying to change laws or trying to open up people's minds, how would you perceive moving forward and achieving a Galt's Gulch in today's society? How would you envision that actually occurring? I guess would be my bottom line question.
Well, I want to actually separate some of these things, because as an organization, we're about promoting the philosophy of objectivism, and so we're not necessarily an organization that would be or can even promote a lot of these ideas. What is important from my perspective is just to define whether these alternative communities that many use the Galt's Gulch moniker, whether or not that's an accurate usage of the term. So that was a major point of my presentation. I think personally, certainly I've moved to New Hampshire. I'm part of the Free State Project. But whether or not Galt's Gulch, as it was originally envisioned, is what is the best thing to do, that's up for debate. I just want to make sure that we ground and have a conceptual understanding of what Galt's Gulch is, so that when people throw that name around, they're doing it with a firm understanding of the concepts.
Okay. Thanks, Jen. Okay. Bob Champion had his hand up for a while. Bob? Bob?
Yes, thank you. Regarding the New Hampshire project and maybe other states, I know Texas has been discussing this, and of course people make fun of it, but the possibility, or how realistic is it that a state could in fact secede from the Union?
I can't.
I think the Civil War settled that one.
Yeah, we had one Civil War. Certainly, other societies have gone through other revolutions. I wouldn't want to comment on the probability of that, but certainly it's on the table in a number of states, and I think there are probably some people in New Hampshire and a whole bunch of areas that are considering it. But I think Will's right that the Civil War provides a pretty good case study.
All right. Let's move on to some written questions here. Suzanne writes in saying that you're speaking a lot about Disneyland and resort, whereas the reality is that most of these resort ideas are not really as real as fiberglass or steel beams. And she also comments that the Citadel, which you discussed, has some dubious aspects to it. It's involved in some very questionable financial activities, and the person running it has been a scammer, she says, in effect. Has been operating under 5 different names and dealing with people in this way isn't the best sign of a reliable activity. Any response there?
It's a great point, and I just want to be very clear. I'm not actually advocating for any of the projects that I described. What I am saying is that a lot of these projects have used Gulch in their materials. They've been described as Gulch. It's been part of their marketing position. And actually my conclusion is that none of these projects are actually the essential definition of Gulch. And I mean, you raised some points about the Citadel. Frankly, in my research, it's been one of the ones that I've had a more difficult time finding a lot of information about. I mean, the plans are pretty weak. I think I showed a diagram of this kind of, they don't even know where in Idaho it's going to be. There are a whole bunch of different issues. And so I'm not advocating for any of these, but I am trying to make sure that when people throw out Gulch, they understand what Gulch means.
Aaron?
Mm-hmm.
Are you there? Sorry, you just tailed off. David, Jen Coffey was following up on her question and said that she agreed with what you said, and perhaps that if she worded her question better, she wondered if you believed that a true Gulch can be achieved in this day and age. Would it be possible to have something like Gulch?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I don't know if Gulch as it was envisioned is even the right approach for the times we're in right now. I mean, when Atlas Shrugged came out in 1957, again, it was intended to be a cautionary tale. We're in a different situation with a different set of circumstances, so I'm not sure that I would even want to replicate Gulch, explicitly. I just want to make sure that we have our terminology right as these new projects come about.
Great. We've got a lot of people interested in asking questions and have written questions, so stick with us and be patient, folks, as we get to these. Following up on this theme of Gulch in today's society, David Fisco writes in saying that Rand had stated that the first truly objectivist society would need to be founded in outer space, and asks, is it rational for us to believe that an objectivist society can be founded in a world that's dominated by Judeo-Christian philosophy?
Well, I may have missed some of that. I heard the outer space, and then I heard the Judeo-Christian thing. I'm trying to understand
the question is, Fisco says that Rand had said that the first truly objectivist society would need to be created in outer space. I don't remember that quote, but I'm not the kind of person who would remember it. And he asks, can we really think that it would be possible to create an objectivist society in a world that's dominated by Judeo-Christian philosophy?
Well, that certainly is a very difficult challenge. I also am not familiar. I've never heard the outer space comment either. I mean, focusing on the Judeo-Christian thing. Again, with the definition being that it's a hidden temporary place based on rational self-interest where people withdraw, where men and women of the mind withdraw, that can happen even though you're surrounded by a Judeo-Christian society. I think, again, the point of it is that it is temporary, hidden, and based on rational self-interest. But you've hit on one of the key points. The whole rational self-interest piece is the part that is the most at odds with Judeo-Christian, political systems, and we are seeing that head on now. I mean, even after this last election cycle, we now have, within it is tough. This is why as I painted in the first part of the presentation, it's a very difficult and challenging environment when the Republican Party is debating between, Rick Santorum and Mike Huckabee and other social conservatives on one hand, and Rand Paul on the other, although even within the religious framework, I'm not even sure how that how that fully shakes out. So, but I'm not advocating for it. I don't think Gulch is about influencing our existing political system through an election. It is about a temporary place for people to withdraw.
Great. Justin Groover writes in, and hello, Justin, student we've worked with. Justin writes in asking, do you have any concrete suggestions for making freedom more attractive and viable to those unacquainted with its inherent precepts? Certainly, he says a philosophical revolution is necessary, and the Atlas Shrugged movie series is a visual start, but is he cynical to think that true freedom and flourishing is more of a bottom-up approach rather than a top-down approach?
Well, I think it's going to be a difficult top-down approach. My background is an entrepreneur, and the companies that I've started have been that have had innovative products or services in their related fields. And so from my experience, the best way to actually demonstrate this and get people on board is to actually do a case study on a small scale and actually show that it works. I think that the more that you're engaging in conversation that can't be demonstrated, it becomes a little bit more, well, you know, look at the discussions about economics, look at Paul Krugman, you have a whole series of different debates on that front. I think a small-scale demonstration of the impact of objectivism and these types of ideas can go a long way, particularly as a great contrast. I mean, we're living at a time where I believe that Stockton, California was today just given the green light to file Chapter 9 bankruptcy. We have the state of Michigan taking over the city of Detroit. None of this as objectivists is particularly surprising, and in fact, we can paint a whole bunch of these different scenarios. We can look at Cyprus, we can look at Greece. Actually, the interconnection between Cyprus and Greece today I think was pretty interesting to acknowledge. However, I think from an objectivist perspective and from a pro-liberty perspective, the sooner that we can demonstrate these principles having a positive effect, the better we're going to be, because otherwise it's going to be finger pointing across the board. Great.
Thanks, Aaron. Another question that was written in to us comes from Thomas Knapp, who says that he's just discussing the idea that Gulch was temporary, and he says, I don't recall the end of Atlas Shrugged mentioning that the inhabitants of Gulch were there only temporarily or for 10 years. And goes on to say that, for example, the end of the novel finds Eddie Willers rather out in the disintegrating society rather than being in Gulch. And then asks, what is there in the current course of society to indicate that it will ever want objectivists back, or that society, or what's there to say that society won't degrade into a totalitarian state, perhaps worldwide? He says his fear is that such as ourselves will be purposely wiped out by the sheer force of numbers, and should we be not trying to prevent the collapse rather than thinking we will be called upon to fix it once it's broken beyond the possibility of fixing?
Well, I mean, I think trying to fix it in these incremental measures is it's a daunting task. I mean, it certainly is a reasonable concern. I mean, my in-laws moved here from the Soviet Union and actually had to bribe their way to get out of the Soviet Union to get to the United States, and so certainly but totalitarianism ultimately collapses based on the fact that it's not self-sustaining or self-supporting. It is I mean, at the end of the day, it's a pyramid scheme. And so, but I go back to my previous point, which is a positive production of or example and case study of the values of objectivism, of individualism and reason and freedom. Actually having something to contrast is vitally important. Not only having it, but then figuring out how to market it is very important. I mean, I would say if you look at Detroit versus New Hampshire, which is a city versus state comparison, but I think that even and it's actually not even a pure comparison, but the point is the more you can demonstrate how the principles work in action, the better the better the result that you're going to end up having. But at the same time, if you look at the founding of the country and what we split apart from, and breaking apart from England and all of the trials and tribulations there, I mean, it's not going to be easy, but I think we need to be armed with a positive message, but also an objective understanding and framework of what's actually going on around us as it's going on.
Great. So, in pursuing the idea of whether Galt's Gulch is realizable or practical or needed, Robert Smith, who we had trouble getting on the microphone, writes in to ask, did Ayn Rand think that Galt's Gulch was more of a fictional construct to illustrate the time, to illustrate the issues in the time that she wrote it, about how the men in the mine could theoretically go on strike, or today, could this strike be better organized or supported virtually? And I'll just comment before you answer this that one of the things that's interesting is that about Atlas Shrugged is that the idea of the strike itself, although it crystallized in Rand's mind when she was talking with Isabel Patterson, there had actually been a very similar sort of plot development in an early novella she'd worked out when she was a college student in Russia, where the men of the mind of Europe all go on strike and go away to America to be free from the totalitarianism that's taking over Europe, which I think is funny. But so Robert asks, is it a realistic idea? And if it is there a way to make it work more efficiently today?
Well, I'm going to say, I mean, she wrote the book to be kind of 50 years in advance, and so the idea was that this is a cautionary tale. We have free will. It's not that the course that she outlined in her book was manifest destiny. It was actually something to kind of point out based on clear objective principles what might happen if we don't wake up. So I don't think that when she wrote it, she was thinking, well, here's the blueprint to creating Galt's Gulch. You know, today she was writing this as an example of what might happen if we don't get our act together. And we didn't get our act together, and unfortunately it's become probably more prophetic than we would like. As to the question of whether or not there are different models and different ways to envision dealing with the problem right now, I would say the answer is yes, and that in fact, you know, I mean, even based on her own philosophy, she would kind of encourage dealing with reality as it exists, and trying to deal with the situation as it is today. So but again, I want to go back to my point, is to just say, well, if you're going to call something Galt's Gulch, she did have a specific meaning, a specific context, but there may be other alternatives and other ways based on where we are in 2013.
Great. Continuing in these questions about making Galt's Gulch real, Cameron Craig wanted to follow up and pursue the line of questioning that Jen Coffey had raised. So, Cameron, I've unmuted you. You can.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think Ayn Rand wrote about Galt's Gulch metaphorically, and I think that's the way I think of it, not as an actual situation. Metaphorically, it means to go on strike, but in the confines of how to lead a rational life. You know, she paid taxes. She had to do the things that you have to do at the point of a gun, so to speak. So she wasn't completely, you know, living out there in an island. I think the approach that she hinted at, that I've adopted, is that the solution to going on strike deals with money and business people. And for this reason, many, not all, but many of the characters in her books were business people. And they were successful business people. And she obviously was a major advocate of business. when you think of politics and money, you can say, well, Obama won 52% of the vote. But did he really win 52% of the vote because, you know, the other 48 wasn't strong enough? Or, you know, we don't need to discuss the election because we're not Republicans. But the point is, and he probably outraised Romney. I think that's been discussed. But did he really outraise the potential money that pro-market people could do? And by that I mean, if you take this approach of turning around the country and going on strike, if you approach it from money and business people first, not exclusively, but first, they have a greater sense of influence. They have a greater power of influence. In the election cycle, we know, we've all read that there was about $1 billion raised on each side. That was on the presidential side. There was probably a lot more when you consider all the others. Well, we also probably all know that there's several people on Wall Street who earn $1 billion a year. It's not a big number anymore. So what if we marshaled business people in mass, in big numbers, to advocate going on strike or turning around the country, you know, piece at a time? You can't abolish the Federal Reserve in a wink. You can't abolish all regulation in a wink. But what if we directed people who had money and influence to start pushing that direction? Identify the crony business people, get them out of the picture, identify the problems, then let that filter down to the people that don't have the money to influence. In other words, I think you can influence more voters. You can't win the election on a popular vote today, and you probably can't in our lifetime, and you might not in 3 or 4 generations. But you might if you marshal the money towards that, because money can influence a great deal more voters than maybe just an individual can. So my whole concept of going on strike, time to shrug, etc., is trying to get enough power of money behind it. Same thing that TAS does and other organizations. They want to raise a lot of money, but I'm going to approach it in a for-profit way. But the point is, let's get people that have money because they can influence more than a single vote. If you took the 100 wealthiest people in the country, what kind of influence could they marshal if they were pushing it towards what we're trying to do? Would they all be pure objectivists? No. We all know people that will contribute to Cato or libertarian causes, or pro-market things, or Jeff Beck, or not Jeff Beck.
Cameron, do you have a question?
No.
All right.
I have a comment that I want to move the direction out of the hypothetical Galts Gulch out in outer space or in Colorado to what you can do here practically. I'd like to hear some comments on that.
All right, thank you.
Well, yeah, what if you can do nothing? I mean, we could talk about that. I've spent my entire life as an entrepreneur and very familiar with our political system and our political process. And I will say that without a cultural revolution, without actually having a debate and spreading the ideas of individualism and reason and commitment and freedom, if you don't do that first, then while we may have spent $2 billion on the last election, we could spend $40 billion on the next election, but we don't have a strong philosophical foundation to build on. And so I'm just not sure how much money. You could aggregate a lot of money, but I just don't think it's going to work without actually having a fundamental cultural change. But that's my take.
Okay, on a lighter note, David Peters and the Atlas Society's own Edward Hudgens both write in saying that if we're going to talk about fighting for freedom and thinking about freedom in outer space, then the thing to read is The Moon is a Harsh Mistress by Robert Heinlein, and people fighting for freedom in the context of space and outer space theories. So let me see. Michael Kelly comments, what's wrong with treating Galt's Gulch simply as a metaphor, like Rand did with Atlantis? Isn't there flexibility of meaning with metaphors, by definition, as it were?
Well, I mean, I think there's some flexibility within certain bounds. I mean, you could easily have a situation where people could interpret Gulch to be any reaction against the government. You could have Reverend Jim Jones. You could have something, you know, a community like this that says, you know, we don't like the way that the government is treating Christianity within this particular context. You could end up having a whole kind of wide range, which is why I'm not suggesting that, you know, the definition should be it's an Ouray, Colorado, it's all of these other things, but there is some essential set of criteria that I think are important to acknowledge, and you could actually pretty quickly come up with ways where you could end up with something that's called Gulch that is pretty far away from Gulch conceptually. And by the way, I will say, with all that as the context, going Galt is different than Gulch. I mean, going Galt and basically, you know, withdrawing, you know, your productive capabilities and stuff, that has a wider variety of forms. But I think that once you get to the realm of communities that are now forming, that have, I would say, as I believe I've outlined, hopefully effectively, some sets of attributes that really don't comport with the core and essential ideas that Rand put forth in her book.
Thanks. Getting to what I think is our last question written down here from Suzanne. Suzanne says, I think following up on Cameron Craig's comments about marshaling money, she says it's a very good point about marshaling money, but in the first place we need to identify those people who are on our side, and in the second place we need to identify those that are willing to support this cause. And she asks, how do you take people from the point of thinking that we're a fringe and get them to realize that it's a potential reality to cause a radical change in society?
It is extremely difficult. We have, in fact, we formed a Business Rights Center to defend businessmen that have been just egregiously and horrendously treated by either the government or the media, and we have other supporters a lot of supporters that aren't willing to do this publicly, and you know, they have boards, they have shareholders, and so to be honest with you, it is a big challenge to find truly committed people that are willing to both support the organization and be public about it, and we have kind of a mix of both. But the reality is, it is a challenge, and it's a challenge that I guess the more effective that we become at promoting our ideas and defending these rights and defending the philosophy, the more willing people will be to align themselves with our organization, and that, in essence, is our strategy. We need to do that. But some of the injustices that have happened that we can't talk about are even worse than some of the things that we have talked about, which is breathtaking in and of itself. If you've read any of the stuff in our Business Rights Center, if you read about Rich Hunt, the story of Greg Reyes, you read any of a number of stories there, and just understand there's probably an order of magnitude or more of that is even more horrifying that we're not even in a position to talk about.
Well, great. There is one more question that had come in. Alicia Ellis, who I thought had signed out, but apparently not, because she just sent in another question, said, she's been listening on the phone, and says she was just wondering if you could tell, she says, can you tell us a little bit more about the Free State Project? Says she's been thinking about signing the pledge to move there when they hit 20,000, and that you mentioned you were a member. And have you chosen to sign the pledge to move, or have you already moved? And can you tell her a little bit about your experience so far?
Well, I signed the pledge to move, and I moved. My wife and I both moved. We were in Massachusetts prior to this, which is a pretty stark comparison. It is, and you know, it's one of those things where now, I mean, there's actually a New Hampshire Objectivist Society, and the president of the Free State Project shows up. I'm not going to claim that she's an objectivist, but we have an open debate and ongoing conversation about it. So I have found New Hampshire relative to Massachusetts to be kind of everything that the billing is accurate. There is definitely more economic and political freedom here, and there's work to be done. I will say it was kind of it was amazing for me. I went through a situation last year. Both of my parents passed away, and not that there's ever a good time for that, but it happened right at about the time that my dad passed away. I guess 10 days after Atlas Shrugged Part 2 was released, and we had all of these premieres that we were doing. And I went to an event in New Hampshire, New Hampshire Liberty Alliance event, and I met one guy. I met this guy, George Lambert, who's a representative. He's a state representative. He's a serial entrepreneur. And he came up to me and he's like, "Can I show you something?" And I said, "Sure." He pulls out his iPhone. He shows me a picture of his wife's Reardon bracelet. And then I talked to him after that, and he's like, "Well, we've actually created a Facebook group called The Bracelet. And so everybody's got these Reardon bracelets." Well, anyway, we ended up doing this premiere of Atlas Shrugged Part 2 in New Hampshire, and the Speaker of the House was there. We had, I don't know, 20 or 30 elected members of the State House there, and all of these other people. And I got to tell you, I'm not familiar with any other state on the, in the United States where that's going to happen. And so, these have been, relationships that are ongoing. On the negative side, the election was not a very favorable one, and so now there's a whole bunch of other stuff going on. But there is a strong objectivist presence and a large body of people here that really are taken by. I mean, it's live free or die state is the motto, but Atlas Shrugged and Objectivism had a really strong foothold in the Granite State.
Well, great. Thank you, Aaron. I think that's the end of our questions. Alicia writes in to say thank you. Oh, wait. One more question just came in. Michael Kelly, belaboring the question of a metaphor, says, staying on the metaphor idea, what do you propose to do about someone who uses Gulch as a metaphor for a retreat or a theme park that doesn't fit the criteria you propose? He's not asking about, he's just, he's meaning kind of a fiction-focused theme that doesn't fit your criteria, not a retreat for something that's communistic.
Well, I guess I'd say one thing I can clearly say that I would do is I would have a webinar on the issue. It's a starting point, but I mean, I do take your point. I mean, there's another group, 10X CEOs, which is a group of CEOs that are in the Fortune or whatever, the fastest growing small companies in America, and their CEOs get together. They've had something called Gulch. I mean, I'm not going out, and I didn't include them in the presentation because it's all right. Yes, you have a group of people to get together, and it's Gulch. It's the Gulch, poker tournament, so on and so forth. So I guess I would say, my litmus test would be if it's something that people are promoting in a very significant way that is just diametrically opposed, then I want to at least highlight those things. And again, I'm not saying that they're bad ideas. I just want to make sure that they're contrasted with the concept of Gulch. They may very well be, great. I just don't want there to be, any confusion. And certainly there are a lot of things that go on under the Gulch name, but that are they're tongue-in-cheek. I mean, they're not, you're not going to end up with, mass suicide at the end. So it's there is definitely a range here of what we should focus on, what we should describe, and what we should put out. And I should have put together a poll question because I'm not sure. I hope this was informative. Part of, if there is interest in this idea, and it sounds like there have been a lot of questions of interest on, the Free State Project, on some of these other projects. I'm personally interested in this, and I'm interested in interviewing the head of Seasteading Institute and all these other things just to get maybe do a webinar like this, except where not where I'm talking as much, but maybe a shorter form, maybe even 15, 20-minute interview, and then a longer Q&A. I'm not sure if people have a strong interest in that, and I guess this will be the subject of a follow-up email.
Yeah, speaking of which, Michael Stokel writes in saying, can you comment about the Free State Wyoming project?
I can't that much. I actually have a list, and actually, if you can talk, I'm cataloging it. There was a Free State project that was announced in Kentucky. I've heard about an initiative in Wyoming. There's a liberty-oriented Lone Star, something or other in Texas. There are other. The list that I went through is by no means complete, but I don't have anything particularly informative to say, but I am always eager to learn more about other activities that are going on.
All right. We're getting to the end of our written questions, but Donovan Albanese had his hand up, and we'll go back to Donovan. Oh, sorry. Donovan, did you have a question?
I guess in light of some of the comments that I heard, I guess my thought was that the point of the strike in Atlas Shrugged was to demonstrate what happens to the world without the producers. I don't think it was meant to intend to be a model for how to change the world, which is what I kind of was gleaning from some of the comments here. In fact, I think Ayn Rand was very focused on education and getting objectivism into the universities. She actually often opposed these kinds of libertarian projects, and I think you can find that in her various newsletters that she was against those things. In terms of a producer strike, I think she also commented that the men of ability withdraw on their own without any need of an organized strike, since the incentives to produce have been curtailed. So I guess, and beyond that, I just think that, yes, it's true that there is this concept of Galt's Gulch being a getaway for people who are organizing a strike, but on the other hand, there is the view, as I expressed before, as an objectivist Atlantis. So most people that I think are trying to use the word Galt's Gulch are using it in that second way. And of course the issue becomes how consistent are they being with the vision that Ayn Rand had, or what would be considered an objectivist Atlantis. So in that sense, I'm proud to support the Atlas Society in its endeavors to promote objectivism, because I think that that's the way that we're going to change the culture. It's not going to be by getting a handful of people to withdraw from the world. I don't think that was the intention of the book. So that's my final comment there.
Yeah, Ayn Rand was often asked, was it time to shrug? And her answer was usually no, because even though she abhorred the mixed economy and advocated full economic freedom and abhorred political restrictions and advocated a free political environment, she drew a real line between what she regarded as the essentially free world, where the basic norms of the market economy still ruled and where basic freedoms of speech and association were still respected, and the unfree world. And that is, she thought, as long as you were part of the free world politically, in that sense, it was still worth trying to change the culture from within. And so there's various places where she comments that way.
I would say, I mean, to the point, I don't know that any of the organizations that are using Galt's Gulch in their title or in their positioning have actually thought it through at all. I think it's not necessarily a deep understanding, or that their focus or even emphasis is on conveying the ideas and the concepts in a consistent manner. So hopefully that came through. I'm actually stating that I don't think these projects are Galt's Gulch. But I would say from the beginning of the presentation, and when Rand was working on this, I suspect had we had indices for economic and personal and political freedom in 1957, we would have been probably at the top of the list. And I think even in Rand's own mind, we were at the top of the list. I think we're in a different situation now. With respect to academia being, academia is not what it was in 1957 either. We're at a point right now where the government is controlling all student loans. The government is controlling curriculum and investment in research and development. I mean, this is actually run amok. This is so. While her approach may have been to influence education and influence higher education, I would actually put it back this way. Here we are, 56 years after Atlas Shrugged. Where are all of the objectivists in higher academia? And why do we think that that's a good approach at this point? So but I controversially throw that out.
All right.
Well,
go ahead, Donovan.
No, I guess my reaction to that is simply that the culture, you have to kind of you have to have a theory on how the culture is going to be influenced. One of the major ways in which it's influenced is, of course, through art. So I think having a film like Atlas Shrugged is helpful. I think it leads people to the book, which is far more detailed than what can be presented in a movie. But ultimately, you've got a philosophical foundation. I mean, there's a lot there that you have to deal with, and that's an educational process. So all these people who've read Atlas Shrugged, who they're not persuaded, you have to say, well, what's going on there? And I don't think it's simply an issue of, evasion on with each person. I think that there's a whole package of problems as to why people don't jump on board after reading Atlas Shrugged or start studying Objectivism more. So the focus on how to change the culture, of course, is different than the title of your discussion. But I do think that to do that, we have to look at, I think there's a trickle-down intellectualism that happens. And so this is why I think Rand was so focused on higher education and that the consequence of the people that would graduate from colleges is that they would go on to get jobs either in the arts or in writing or journalism, and that they would have an effect. But it's a huge change. I mean, I'm studying right now this
theory.
Right, but I'm looking at the history even of Christianity to see how it took hold, and it was in conflict with the Greek and Roman culture. It didn't happen in 60 years. It took quite a long time for the culture to change. So I don't look at 60 years and say, oh, we're in big trouble. I see objectivism spreading. I just don't know if we'll be able to spread quickly enough compared to what's happening in the world. So that's really the big question is how fast can we spread these ideas because they're so important.
I agree. I guess I would say all of this was done, whether it was Plato and Aristotle or Christianity being spread or Rand being spread. This was all of this was pre-internet, pre-information technology. I think that there is a significant game changer in how information is communicated and how it is processed. And I think that education is an important concept. I think that academia is a leveraged channel for distribution of objectives. Information is a more debatable concept, but certainly a more debatable concept. I mean, I think it's a good conversation.
I mean, it's very hard with young people because, you know, by the time someone is 25, it gets very, very difficult to persuade them. Younger people are more open to revisiting philosophy, but I see it all the time with very small children that they're being taught altruism and collectivism and social metaphysics. So if that's your foundation, and that's what the foundation in the culture is, through art, through parents, through church, through the schools, the public schools in particular, and the universities, yeah, we've got an uphill battle. So I wouldn't be too hard on ourselves, considering our context.
Well, thanks, Donovan. This is a discussion we can continue on another day when we continue to diagnose the culture and its difficulties and problems. And thanks. Thanks for all the good work you do, Donovan.
Thank you, Will.
Thank you very much.
Oh, it sounds like a good conversation to have.
I think that's the end of our questions, Aaron. So, any final words?
No, I'm amazed. I mean, there's still 38 people here, you know, 1 hour and 45 minutes into it on a Monday. So that to me is always a good sign. So I appreciate everyone for participating in this. We'd love to get your feedback.